Hallo Freunde, willkommen API review overflow. Um, Still down to 2 red. We're holding at almost done with red. We'll see how long that lasts. Um, but they're red, so we'll start. Something about dynamic interface castable implementation attribute, which is almost longer than my screen. 41529er.
So back in .NET 5, we introduced the iDynamic interface castable interface to enable people to write their own interop that behaved similarly to the COM interop that's built into the runtime. And the way that that worked was through a combination of dynamic interfaces and some hooks into the type system through that interface, as well as this attribute. So we required that implementation interfaces, which are the interfaces that provide an implementation for a given type that doesn't actually directly implement the interface, needs to have this attribute on it. So, for example, in this case, bar is an implementation of foo, but since bar doesn't have an entry point for foo, when someone tries to call frob on an object that is using bar as the implementation, it'll throw an entry point not found exception. So it ends up being a bad experience, and there's no analyzers to ensure that you're writing your implementation correctly. I probably could have given a better example.
Just so everybody's aware, this is a super complicated and advanced scenario. So it is not simple.
Yeah, it is a super complicated advanced scenario that is easy to mess up. When I was initially implementing this, using this feature with the CS1RT project, I messed up in a few cases around this for both of the diagnostics and code fixes that I mention here while trying to get this working.
Okay, so this is an analyzer that tells you you haven't done the one thing that we said never to do, and you need to do it.
Yeah, the analyzer telling you you haven't done the thing that you need to do to make this work.
Well, but using DIMS to provide an implementation for a base member is the one thing we know you should never do with DIMS. It is the one rule we have for DIMS, is never do that.
Well, within a VCL. Yeah.
That is the entire way that iDynamic interface castable works.
Fair enough. So this is just an analyzer, and basically what the analyzer is doing is if you have inherited members that are not visible directly on your interface level, then... Or no, because it's not even that.
You need to provide the implementation.
So in your example here with the interface bar, would Baz also have a body?
So Baz is an example of the other diagnostic. That you need to do two things with Baz. A, it needs to have a body, and B, it needs to be sealed. Because even if it's not sealed and it has a body, the runtime will try to look up on the actual type of the object, give me the implementation of Baz, and then the runtime type will be like, I don't implement bar, because it doesn't. It says it implements foo, but the implementation of foo is bar. So it needs to be sealed so the runtime doesn't try to do...
Okay, so with whatever this attribute means, everything needs to be a dim.
Yeah.
Okay. Fair enough.
Yeah, the analyzer makes sense to me, honestly. Like you're detecting code that will never ever work at runtime, and you're telling them this is what you have to do.
Yeah. The two questions that I have are DIMS supported in VB.NET, aka do we need to provide a code fix there, or just a warning?
I can answer this. No, because this is only for a COM wrappers scenario, and COM wrappers is not supported in VB.NET, so doesn't matter.
Okay.
That would be my argument. Like, this is for the COM wrapper scenario, unless you're thinking this is useful other places.
It could be. I don't know if it is, but it could be.
I mean, this is for dynamic interface castable implementation, which is the COM wrappers thing, right?
Yeah, it's connected to the COM wrapper scenario. The only reason I ask is that I was prototyping out this, and then I realized that I don't think that DIMs are even supported in VB.NET for like providing implementation of a parent interface method on an interface. So
Yeah,
basically,
which, I mean, basically, if you feel like adding it to your analyzer, what it really means is if you see an instantiation of dynamic interface castable implementation and the language is VB, that you issue an error, this feature cannot work in VB.
yeah,
Like,
that's what I was thinking.
This feature
And that
requires
actually-
dynamic interface methods, and VB does not have them. Sorry.
Yeah. And then the other thing based on that was there was a comment down below from someone in the community about whether or not we want the severity of these to be error instead of warning. I don't know if we allow out-of-band analyzers or even in-box analyzers that aren't provided by the compiler itself to be to be error severity, or if we can only go up to warning.
I don't think we have a prohibition on it. We wouldn't. I don't think we would change something that had previously shipped as warning to error. And if this is, I guess, if it's on by default, we probably want it to be warning. If it shipped with the I guess is the interface itself new in 6?
No, it
Sorry,
was
the
in
attribute. Okay. Because if the attribute and the analyzer ship in the same release, then you can totally say error because you can't, by definition, break anyone's existing compiled
Okay.
code. But so yeah, warning's probably fair.
Okay. So we'll do warning here and then warning in and just a straight up warning in VB.NET, being like, this is never going to work in VB.NET. You can't implement this correctly.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the error concern is because we've already shipped it.
Yeah, I mean, if Emo were here, I would let him say what the rules are because he would know them. I know that we often don't like adding errors. We add warnings and people compile with warn as error, and then we shrug and say, then don't do that. The compiler team no longer believes they can shrug and say don't do that. But yeah, so I don't know what our rules are for introducing new errors as on by default, but introducing a new warning is on by default. I think we've done that already. So
Yeah, it's easy. I noticed when working on a previous analyzer that in the Roslyn analyzer's repo, it's easy to say that something is on by default warning. It is not easy to say something is on by default error, or even that something is error.
Would this run against Net5 apps, this analyzer, or would it only be if I targeted Net 6.0?
We could make it run only against Net 6.0 if we wanted, but if we do warning, it should run against Net 5, I think.
Okay, because I think
I don't know what the analyzer team is going to say and how they configure what is the default for a particular platform.
right. I think that impacts this decision as well, though, because if we're saying it only runs in Net 6, then you have to be targeting Net 6, and now it's like for a new error in Net 6, you've upgraded your app and now you're getting an error. I think that falls in line with that's okay. But if you're Net 5 app and you just upgrade to the new SDK, and now the analyzer runs and it gives you errors and it's broke, I think that falls in the that's not okay category. I know that one falls in the it's not okay category.
Okay.
I think I would be fine forcing this just on .NET 6. Like, people have gotten far enough on .NET 5. It was really only designed for the COM wrapper scenario, like in large part. I'm sure other people could have used it for whatever absurd nonsense they want. But if they're going to upgrade to 6, I think this was a mistake that we didn't have it, right? Like, it was just a missed. We didn't have time, so we didn't think about it. So I agree with Eric. Like, maybe we should just say this is only for 6 and error, because it really is wrong. I think that the OP on this one that asked about the error had a good point. It's literally broken. So
yeah, like it, like, theoretically, it does, like, if you implement only some of the methods, it does work. But then if you call any methods that aren't implemented, you get an entry point not found exception.
Right, and they can easily just throw a not impl themselves, and it actually makes sense as opposed to some weird runtime case.
Yeah. I will say the call stacks for when the runtime, like when you don't follow either of these recommendations and then you try to call something, it gets really weird. Especially the second one, where you're trying to call a virtual method on the same interface that has a default implementation. And it's like, this doesn't implement it. Well, I can find no implementation.
I think that almost argues that it should be an error then.
Yeah, the second one definitely should be an error because it will never work at runtime.
Yeah. So, wrote down that we think the error on by default error is probably the right answer, but made an appeal to emo to probably then turn around and make an appeal to someone else to ask what our actual rules for that are.
Okay. Sounds good to me.
I guess unless there was dissent that no one was offering. I usually ask for that.
Yeah.
Cool. Do we have Laomi today?
Yeah, I'm here.
Cool. All right. Provide a JSON content of T type that uses pre-generated serialization metadata 51544.
So so far in .NET 6, we've been introducing a new pattern for JSON serialization, where this source generator generates type metadata that the serializer uses to perform the serialization of types. And this metadata is stuff that in 5.0 and previously the generator was generating, the system text JSON serializer was generating these things at runtime using reflection, and that has been pushed to compile time, which gives benefits of primarily in this scenario is about size, where we're able to trim out reflection code parts because we've already done the work in compile time. So we're able to trim out some of system text JSON because we don't need that coding. Also with the source generator, we're able to figure out what converters are needed to serialize and deserialize the type, because converters are the actual mechanism that we use to turn JSON into objects and objects into JSON. So previously in 5.0, we would keep all the converters around because the only information would have was the type, and the type could be anything. But with source generation, we're able to see like what types and therefore what converters, and we don't secure everything. So the system net HTTP JSON APIs are built on top of system text JSON and allow users to turn their .NET objects and serialize them somewhere to some destination, like say over the wire. And so the JSON content type is a type that we have that that defines some object that can be serialized to JSON. So underneath that, the mechanism was just for serializing that was just to call JSON serializer and pass it a string to serialize some content to. And we had APIs to create this JSON content type. We took JSON serializer options, and we would call this serializer with the options. That pattern of passing JSON serializer with the options is now we are determining that we're defining it as the like linker size unfriendly way to do it in 6.0, because for backward compat we need to keep all of that code. So if we're exposing new APIs to create this JSON content type that can take pre-generated information about types, so this JSON serializer context and JSON type info types, then the underlying serialization mechanism can call new overloads that take those types and call the serializer in a way that we can get the benefits of source generation. So here you see that I said we can add a new JSON content of T type, which is the type JSON content type. And then the reason why it's typed is we want to create an instance of it with typed JSON type info T value, which we need to pass to the serializer. So that's why we have the T value there. And so we just have this type and the create methods, which I propose to go on the original JSON content type, just because, I mean, those are already visible to users. Users know about them, and it's also to avoid a scenario where for the overloads, for the cases where we pass a context type itself to the serializer, that's for cases where we don't know what the type is. So input type. So in that case, the type is treated as object. So we want to have it. So the generic type there will be JSON content of object, and it's better to put those create methods on the JSON content type, which is not generic, so that users can't write things like JSON content of int, and because the T could be anything. So we don't want JSON content of T to create a JSON content of object. So that's why I put the create methods on the JSON content type. And so the usage there, just scrolling down, if the API is understandable, would just be, so in systemnet TCP JSON, we have this put as JSON async and post as JSON async. Both of them serialize JSON content to some stream destination. So here we'll call, rather than calling old APIs that route all the reflection code, we call these new APIs that take the JSON content. The JSON type info and JSON context. So you see that line right before the return is where we create the context, and because it's a new type that has a different implementation, the linker is able to trim out. I mean, we're not going to use the different JSON content type that holds on to all the reflection code that we don't need. Here we just create this new type, and then that type has a different implementation that causes serialization in a different way. And that's basically it. So
how's the... Oh, because they're HTTP content. Okay. I was going to say, how does this last line work? Don't you need like several hundred overloads to make all this work?
Right. So the API here will just be the new type and then new methods to create the type on the existing type.
Are we worried at all about JSON content of T not inheriting from JSON content? Right, that question.
Like conceptually, one would think that would be the relationship. But if we were to do that, the base so the way the serialization works is there's a virtual method on, I believe it's on the client, and then we override that with the implementation to call the serializer with the options-based code. So if we make the new JSON content type derived from that, the linker wouldn't know that it could remove the implementation on the base type. So it doesn't give us the benefit to want of reduced size. You then need to teach the linker that base dot the method. Base dot method wasn't called, so you can trim out that code. But today the linker doesn't know that. So if we make it derived from HTTP content directly, then we don't have the implementation we don't want in the hierarchy, and the linker can't trim it out. So deriving from HTTP content directly is just so that we don't keep code that we don't want to.
So, like the put on JSON async, we have an extension method that is put as JSON async, right?
Yeah, we already do. And this one I'm showing here already exists. And then this call here.
So
like
we are
the JSON content of so you already have that.
okay. So does the general person ever even see a JSON content of T or a JSON content in their current code, or is it mostly just the extension methods?
People do use the JSON content of T type if they want to extend to provide more information on the content, like to say, hey, these are the header types for the content. Because in the implementation that we have in the extension methods, we just use JSON header type. And so if you want to do additional configuration, then you would be interacting with the type directly. And then you could also care about like how much size can I save on my app if I don't use this pattern that routes things around. So yeah, I'd say a good amount of people would care about this API. Yes. Otherwise, we could have just kept it internal and then just have the client extension methods just use internal types, but just like we expose JSON content and the people that use it, I think those same people could care about the size of the apps that use it directly.
But it's not like this is probably less than 1% of .NET users, right?
It's hard to land on that number.
Well, like I don't know why I would ever want to use one. I can't. So I don't understand why anyone would ever want. So really, it's the JSON content of T not deriving from JSON content, even though they're both instantiable. Like that feels a little weird. But if this is you only have like 10 customers in the world, then we don't care. The more customers you have, the more we might care. So the right answer is for you to say that you don't have any customers. And then we don't care.
Yeah, I mean, we could always wait to see if like people ask for it. The question is, we already have the existing type, and then we added it for a reason. So this is analogous to it. I mean, it's just the same type with different like requirements from the user app. So if you want to say want customer feedback, yeah, that's also like acceptable, I'd say.
And there's a very good comment from chat, which is I'll just read it verbatim. Thank you, Kevin Cathcart. The non-generic class has a private constructor and is only created by factories. So if we wanted the inheritance model, we could move the reflection implementation to a new internal derived type.
It's actually what we have today in the code. Is JSON content of T is internal.
Okay, well, because this says that JSON content is sealed.
The JSON content is so good.
Oh, I was going to say the proposal is to make this public, correct?
Yeah, the internal JSON content of T to be public is the proposal.
Right, but does the internal JSON content of T derive from JSON content?
It doesn't.
Right.
It can't. Because...
Right. So it's right now you have. Why am I typing? I can copy paste. You have this with you say you have an internal constructor.
Mm-hmm.
So if you unseal the type, which is no one else can derive from it because it has an internal constructor. Now you just make the existing creates return one of these instead of one of that.
It
So
just does keep.
So
Have
you
a
can move all the
hierarchy and-
reflection code off of the JSON content type into a new internal type. Return that from the create methods that already exist. You don't need to change the declared return type, which you can't anyway. And then now you have the class definition looks more sensible, and somebody who already had a JSON content exposed in their API can now use the JSON content of T. So everything just gets better.
So,
Going from sealed to abstract, not a breaking change.
Going from
It's interesting.
Going from sealed with a non-public constructor to abstract is
Right.
not a breaking change. I mean, like
If you
it
can,
doesn't need to be
if you
declared
can never-
abstract, but it could be.
if you can never subclass it and never instantiate it, then going to abstract, like Jeremy said, is totally fine.
The non-callable constructor is what really makes the change there. I mean, somebody could be doing like activator.create instance, but that's private reflection.
Yeah, who cares?
yeah, but this is helpful. Can still take the code out and have a nice hierarchy.
Right. So, and people who understand the linker can correct me if I'm wrong, but if the only thing that pulls reflection JSON content or whatever you want to call it into the closure is calling one of these existing two methods, then as long as they have 0 calls, then all that code goes away.
Yep, you're right. Yeah, I think this is a good idea.
Cool. Yeah, so
Okay.
we can take this feedback.
But to large part, that doesn't really affect the API that Leomi has brought correct. It's mainly shuffling some things around.
Right. It's just changing
No.
what the base class on the new proposed T1 is.
Yeah.
Yeah, it affects the API, but it makes the API better.
Yeah. But it seems like it seems like a fairly
Yeah, I was going to
small
mark the
enough
note and
change where we
approve.
can still approve it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
This wasn't a pushback.
Okay, great. Yeah, because I would hate to have that, send this back for yet another iteration.
Thank you.
Thank you. Markdown of kind of looking like HTML. Right. What namespace are these?
Systemnet HTTP JSON.
I am the king of copy paste. I'm obviously not. There we go. That's the one I was missing. That just looks so weird. Alright, I'm bad at writing inline diff, but... Alright, so does that look right?
Sounds like we discussed.
I guess I should declare that the new thing
Okay.
extends JSON content.
The diff looks correct.
Yeah, and of course the internal name doesn't matter because it's internal, but... Alright. Objections?
Thanks.
We'll see how many wait what's that gets from people when the email comes out. We have no reds! Yay!
No red.
Alright, so normal backlog. Wow.
Wow.
Alright, string.normalize line endings 40315. Levi?
So I put at the very top of this a link to the API proposal at the very top. Yeah, so basically the scenario is if you're transmitting or serializing strings from machine to machine, different operating systems have different newline representations. And we recently added an API onto exception that allows you to set an exception stack trace based on some arbitrary string stack trace that you get from a remote machine. Well, the stack trace that you get from a remote machine will be using the remote operating system's newline conventions, which might not necessarily match your current operating system's newline conventions. So the end result of this is that you could end up seeing malformed data in the stack traces. That's just one concrete example. We have examples across unit tests and other places where we really just want to say, you know what, whatever line ending this data happens to have, like I just want to normalize it to my operating system's current line, which again on Windows would be carriage return line feed, Unix is just line feed and so on. So yeah, so that's the API, normalize line endings. So string.normalize line endings, if you pass it null as a parameter for the line ending parameter, it will default to using environment.newline. You can pass it whatever arbitrary string you want to here as well. You could pass it an empty string, which would remove every single new line from the string. You could pass it a smiley face, which will replace every new line with a smiley face, and so on. We don't put any restrictions on what parameter you can pass in there. Additionally, if we're adding this to string, we should probably consider adding it as an extension method hanging off the read on the span of char, so that you can enumerate these lines in an allocation-free fashion. The behavior of this is such that it identifies everything that the Unicode specification calls out as a line ending. It looks for carriage return, line feed, carriage return, line feed, paragraph separator, line separator, and next line. And it replaces all of them with whatever you tell it to replace it with. And I have some examples showing inputs and outputs down below. But
Right.
That's in a nutshell how this works.
So it's just string.replace an array of things to one thing.
Basically, yeah. And also guarantee to run in a sane O of whatever.
Mm-hmm.
O of n.
Do we need like a more generic API that it's like string got replaced with like a list of potential things to replace with?
I did consider that. The reason that I opted not to go with it is because this is a very concrete scenario that can benefit from a specialized API. And doing a generalized replace API is a lot more complex in terms of what algorithmic complexity do we want to guarantee. Whereas this, we can make very concrete guarantees that we wouldn't otherwise be able to make for generalized APIs. Because I anticipate that this is going to be run over untrusted input. And as a result, I absolutely have to guarantee that it runs at O of n time.
Gotcha. Out of curiosity, like how many Unicode line separators are there? Like you named 2, I think.
There are 7 total.
Okay.
And we will be searching for all 7.
Okay, so I have a question regarding like if Unicode get updated later, so we are willing to update this list. Is this true or no?
I anticipate we would update it. However, I want to say that Unicode has locked their list of line endings, but I can double check that. There are certain things in Unicode where they explicitly call out this list will never ever change under any circumstance.
Out of curiosity, couldn't we have like a series of constants for the well-known APIs, for the well-known line endings? Like, I think there's one for like, there's something about characters, like path characters, and then you can use that to basically construct this yourself.
If you write this yourself using string.replace, it will be an O of n squared algorithm, which is not appropriate to run over untrusted input.
But don't we have a string.replace that takes an array of char? I guess the problem is you want CRLF to be treated as one atomic entity.
CRLF is the weird one.
Because it's the reason it makes you need string instead of char.
Also, I don't believe I don't believe that API is guaranteed O of n.
And we own it, so.
Thing.
Sorry.
So isn't it?
Who's talking?
Stefan.
Sorry. So about the n squared thing, is it? Are you counting the sequences that are being replaced as part of n here? Because I figure like most usage of that, it would be constant.
So it's
like I wouldn't expect that to be untrusted.
It's O of m times n, where m is the replacement sequence that you pass in, but in reality, that's going to be null or environment.newline, which will be bounded by 2. The problem is if you naively call something like string.indexOf and pass in 6 different characters to it, that is actually an O of n squared search, not an O of n search.
It's not O of nm. It's actually n squared.
It's actually n squared because we cap our vectorization optimizations. I think end at n equals at searching for 4 different characters, and once you go above that, we fall back to search for the first one. Did that fail? Search for the second one. Did that fail? And so on. Which means each individual call to index of is n, but the particular scenario for using this API is that you want to split across new lines, which means that you're calling it potentially n times over an n length string, which is n squared.
I see, because it's the splitting. It's not just...
It's the splitting.
Right, so it's not just replacing, it's creating multiple... But is it splitting? Oh, you're saying if you do a custom thing, not this API. This API just...
Well, this API is splitting with the intent of recap. But yeah.
So I'm talking specifically about a replace API that takes multiple characters or potentially character sequence to replace by. And assuming that that is not changing, right? Like the characters to replace, it's by user input. I don't see the algorithm complexity issue there.
There is no general purpose API for that right now that runs in an acceptable time frame. And
That's
again, the
right?
reason
So this is nice for new lines.
it's nice for new lines, but to be honest, we don't really have scenarios aside from new lines right now. Like
I'm thinking
I
of
would
like
rather
normalizing paths and things like that. But yeah,
normalizing paths is its own weirdness because you also have to search for things like ... /. Like it's not a simple search and replace. And depending on what segment you're searching for, you might need to replace it with a different substring. Like I intentionally didn't. In fact, I think there was actually a comment in here where someone had suggested having. Maybe it wasn't here. Maybe it was somewhere else. But someone somewhere had suggested having a similar API, and I'm like, well, we would have to. The API that we create would have to be. I'm trying to remember how to phrase it. I mean, it was specific for paths, so it's not really relevant for this, so never mind. But it came down to it would just be very hard to use because it would need to support lots of different things, which means it could never do one thing easily.
I get that this can be like better optimized than a general thing. I just wasn't so sure about the algorithmic complexity, assuming that the characters to replace were effectively constant.
Yeah. One interesting thing about this is I did grapple and I had some conversations with Eric offline. Like, hey, should we do only carriage return line feed in CRLF as opposed to searching for all these things? Because that matches what text reader .readline does. However, Tarek did raise an interesting point offline, which was that like, well, if you want to support this in more advanced scenarios, such as people using IDE text editor, stuff like that, like they could be using different new line sequences. And additionally, this isn't really appropriate for protocol parsing anyway, because your protocol might dictate specifically only carriage return or only line feed or only CRLF, whereas we would be searching for all of them anyway.
Just minor question here about like, if you find carriage return line feed, I mean, you treat this as one entity as end of line, right?
Any carriage return that's found swallows the next line feed if it exists.
Yeah, so CRLF, I mean, so...
Yeah.
But if you got the reverse sequence, I mean, like LFCR, you will treat this as two lines at that time.
Correct.
Yeah.
So as a concrete example of where this will be inappropriate for protocol parsing, like I'm looking at the HTTP 1.1 spec right now, and HTTP 1.1 mandates that lines are terminated specifically with carriage return line feed, not carriage return, not line feed, but carriage return line feed. So even if we were to make this API support only those three, it would still be inappropriate for general purpose protocol parsing.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Right, like Kestra would never use this. But I'm wondering, yeah, the other thing that I could see an API like this being useful for is just like stripping certain characters, right? If it was more general, if it was like to replace with multiple characters or whatever.
Yeah, and I'm not at all opposed to introducing such a general API, but I think a general API would require a bit more thought, and this solved an immediate concrete problem.
Right, and I don't want to say that's pushback on this, so we can talk about that offline. This is a fine API.
No, I agree with you. We should absolutely consider that.
Levi, I think was this originally for the exception scenario, or is there something else?
The exception scenario kind of made this more important. but it's an API that's, if you go on like Stack Overflow or whatever, like you'll see people asking about this all the time. Like
Okay.
it's just nice for the ecosystem.
So I guess the only question I would have then is, would it make sense to just customize this inside of the exception API to make sure like it's always what the platform is to make sense?
Oh yeah, we could absolutely call this as an implementation detail from wherever we want to.
What I was meaning is like, is it just the exception, or is this it, as you pointed out, is this just general purpose useful everywhere?
It's general purpose useful everywhere, in my opinion. The exception stuff is what's forcing our hand right now, because we do have a concrete scenario where someone has asked, how do I handle this? And I did not want to make the exception type start munging the incoming data as a matter of policy. Like I wanted the type to just be like, look, you called the property setter, we're setting it to the exact string that you passed us. We're not fixing it up internally, but we're giving you the option to call a helper API to do it if you care about that.
Yeah. Also, I'm seeing you are providing this memory extensions stuff. I mean, like enumerate lines.
Yeah.
Do we need API like the string one, which is just to replace everything and return you, I mean, the result in other span or something like that? So you don't have to enumerate yourself. I mean.
Oh, so something that does the replacement, so replace into a separate span?
Yeah.
We could, that would just take a source and a destination, but yeah, we could consider that. Let me check the APIs that are already on memory extensions.
Because somewhere we have like trim.
Mm-hmm. Well, trim doesn't write to a destination buffer
That's
though.
true.
Like trim just gives you back a slice.
Yeah.
We have
Trim is
we
fancy
have like
slice.
2 upper and 2 lower,
Yeah.
which will write to a destination buffer.
And those run memory extensions?
Yes.
That's why
And they're
we shouldn't name
specialized over
things
RAS or
extensions.
char. Yeah. Well, they are extensions over char. RAS.
Oh, because it ends up looking like source.toUpper destination.
Yes.
Yeah.
One interesting thing is that this could result in a string larger than what you pass into it, which means we would have to pessimistically start doing work and then report back to you, sorry, the destination buffer you gave us wasn't large enough.
Yeah, because really it needs to be a try. Because, yeah, your new length could be length times length of replacement.
Yeah, 2 upper and 2 lower currently return -1 if you give them a destination that's too small. But it's like, for 2 upper and 2 lower, we literally know that the destination needs to be the exact same size as the source.
Yeah.
Whereas here, we couldn't make that determination. We would actually have to do useful work and then potentially throw it away.
Yeah, so I think that would need to be designed separately, not something we're going to be able to wing up here.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. My other question is, should we have overrides that take character, not string? So it will be, you don't have to have a complete string to do that.
You mean as the replacement line ending, or
yeah.
as the input?
As the line ending, I mean, like instead of line ending be string, can be character. Just I'm replacing all end of strings with this specific character, and that's it.
Is the idea that you would replace it with a constant character, or that you would have a variable somehow?
Yeah, I would best use a character that you replace with. I mean, like I can choose like Unicode FFFF as a marker for end of line for me. And
so if you were using a const, you could just pass that in as a single character const string. I'm not opposed to having a char here, but I anticipated that most people would pass in environment.newline or an equivalent, which is already a string. but I'm not opposed to having a char if that's easier for people, or even a raws of char.
I'm just raising because like we have like the other APIs like index of and this stuff. I mean, like we support characters also, but yeah, I can see. I mean, I mean, like string maybe is enough here. Yeah, I can see that.
I saw this as similar to string.replace, honestly, where if the input was a char, then, or sorry, where it takes string or char. And this is string because this is a string. But yeah, I would be okay with adding that overload if it's useful.
I mean, with string.replace char, that's because it knows ahead of time exactly what the allocation size is, right? There's a special substitution, and because here you don't, and that's really just a way of signaling, I promise that I'm replacing something with the exact same length. And here, I don't know that. Yeah, I mean, my general answer is less is more.
Yeah, character term line feed is just messing absolutely everything up, honestly.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a good comment from chat that, normalize line endings right here. You can take text that was written as text for a sensible universe and send it to HTML by replacing all your new lines with empty breaks.
Yes.
So it's the happy, like, pseudo pre HTML text.
I mean, to be perfectly honest, if you're doing things correctly, like, you should never end up in that situation, because presumably you have HTML encoded the data before you're doing line break replacement, and HTML encoding the data will also encode character terms and line feeds.
Will it?
It will.
Okay. Fair enough.
Because you can't have those characters in HTML attributes, which means they have to be encoded.
Well,
because our encoder handles them.
But they can't appear as a less than BR optional / greater than doesn't make sense in an attribute either. So I thought we had a different thing for body encode and attribute encode.
Full framework did, core did, because core just says I am universal. I can be used absolutely anywhere. I will encode any character that can't be represented everywhere safely.
Fair enough.
So interesting scenario, but I don't think this API would make sense for it.
Well, but again, similar scenarios of you have a non-standard representation of a line feed. It's similar to your Unicode smiley face. Of you have a world where you need to do something.
Tarek gave such a scenario earlier.
Replace it with a graphene.
With something. Well, Tarek's scenario earlier was I want to replace it with something in the private range, which totally makes sense. Yeah. Private range is specifically for your app.
Right. Well, because now you're down to a single char that you can now do the char replace later. You've set yourself up for not needing to call this again multiple times, depending on your different replacements. So, okay, I'll just say things that I had thought while you're looking through this. You've covered most of them. This is normalizing all kinds of line ending to one kind of line ending. Is that what we want, or do we want something that is like, Windows to Unix and Unix to Windows and other named things? Like there's the legacy name called Mac from, years ago, which is the carriage return instead of line feed.
Yes.
That Macs don't use anymore, which is a difficult name to use now. But
yeah, so that is supported by this. The reason that I didn't say we replace environment.newline with something of your choosing, things like that, is because the scenario here is I got the data from a source where I'm not necessarily sure what OS produced it. So I need to pessimistically support any potential incoming format and then turn it into something that's native to my OS.
Yeah, we already running into these scenarios today. I mean, we got some data from Windows and people running on Linux, and
honestly, we already have this problem anywhere or in a bunch of our unit tests of because at quote, the compiler will embed the new line of the operating system that you ran the compiler on. And
yeah,
sometimes we want that to be to make sense on the place that we're running the tests. But
if you scroll down to the very bottom of the issue, I actually have a backlink from a system code DOM test that ran into this.
So
I'm like, hey, this API would help you.
So in particular, I don't think we want like normalize from X to Windows or anything like that. I think it's good that it takes a specific string, because there's cases where like solution files only reliably work on in VS if they're CRLF, and otherwise you end up with VS complaining. And so a lot of editor config files or get attributes files specifically say, for your solution file, check out as CRLF, regardless of what the get checkout settings are otherwise. There's other files like bash files, which only work with new lines reliably.
I never knew that about solution files. That is bizarre.
Yeah,
I mean, really,
it might be better in the latest versions, but I remember like at least 2 releases ago, it was bad enough that we started adding to our editor config the right settings.
Yeah, so really it's more of a question of right now it's basically a flexible fix-up routine, and do we think that there's value in doing targeted search and replace? But I guess the targeted is you just call string.replace yourself.
Yeah.
So I only want to replace things that looked like Unix new lines, not also paragraph separators or line separators or floating carriage returns or what have you. But
yeah, that's basically string.replace. I mean, you do have to have a little bit of weirdness to handle carriage return line feed, but yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So you have a question. So line ending. I definitely think right now with the parameter name line ending that it's a little ambiguous if that's search or replace. So I do think the parameter name could use, replacement new line, replacement line ending, replacement ending. Is my personal opinion.
I like replacement new line if we're like setting.
I'll just defer to the wisdom of the crowd. There is one potential weirdness with this API that passing null versus passing empty string does give you different behavior. Is that good, bad?
What's the null behavior again? It's default?
Null is use the current OS's new line, and empty is literally remove
behavior, right?
Yeah.
Well,
and empty is literally remove.
Argument non-nullable, and then just reject null.
And then force you to pass environment.newline?
No, make a zero parameter
Right.
overload.
Or, yeah, I thought that existed.
I mean, we could do that. It is, I think, a little strange to have something that's zero parameter that does not forward null to the parameter full overload, but
it happens all the time. Especially with complicated things like I pass environment.newline. And then that makes you set up easier for if you want to add the char one at the same time, or not. Because it's like, well, where do we put the defaults, and what do we feel about the defaults with imbalanced signatures? And because if we were going to add the char one, I was going to suggest we just add the zero parameter one anyway.
So parameterless one that takes a non-nullable string, and maybe if we have a scenario one that takes a char.
Yeah, one more question. I'm not sure if you already discussed this or not. So for the naming about normalized line ending, should we name it replace line endings instead? The word normalize has some meaning with the strings in general about normalization data with Unicode and this stuff. So
that's fair.
I want to avoid people think about it like it's related to the normalization APIs or something.
I could buy that argument.
Yeah, and that actually makes it more clear that it's replacing anything it thinks is a line ending with whatever it is that you give it.
So replacement text then would probably be an appropriate parameter name.
Sounds good.
Yeah, one last question is implementation details here. It's so this we should take care about big endian and little endian cases, right? I mean, because we are handling CRLF. So
yeah, we don't actually care about endianness here because every character will already be represented in the machine's native endianness format, so we should already be okay.
Okay.
Because the idea is the endianness replacement, or sorry, the endianness conversion should take place at the time where you read this from the wire and turn it into a string. At that point, once the string is materialized, each individual element must be in the machine's native representation.
Okay. Yeah, makes sense.
No, it is a good point, though.
Looks good to me.
Okay, so for the memory extensions version, do we already have a split enumerator for span? I feel like we do.
We have an enumerate. We never added split, but we added enumerate rooms to memory extensions. This was based off of that. Oh, we do have split. Yes. Sorry, I'm looking at string. Sorry, 1 second. I'm looking at the wrong API.
Okay.
Memory extensions. Correct. We never added split because we checked it in and then reverted it before it shipped because we had concerns with it. What this is modeled off of is the enumerate rooms API. Yes, I did get that correct.
Yeah, so I get my question here, which is a little bit of the, you're like, well, wouldn't be good for protocol work because definitions of what line ending you're allowed to accept should we overload these enumerate lines for what does it think is a line ending, but then at that point it's just multi-split or single split. And so do we have a split enumerator? So what was the concern with split enumerator and why wouldn't it apply here?
The concern with split enumerator was that splitting is a very complicated operation, especially once you start wanting to apply policy to how the splitting takes place. For example, are you removing empty segments? Are you splitting on a single thing versus multiple things, and so on? If you're returning a single split enumerator type, that type has to hold every single one of the options because it's a restaurant, and you can't return a specialized enumerator based on the options that are passed in. That ends up making split very expensive because every single caller has to pay for potentially every single option that you had ever passed into the call site. This, because it's opinionated, does not suffer that same problem because it does one thing and one thing only.
Fair enough.
Basically, there are no options.
Yeah.
And if you care about what the new line that it saw was, then you have to write something on your own.
I mean, you could always go back one in the string and see what the data was. There's things like memory extensions overlaps and whatnot that will give you that data.
Why do we need read-only span and span overloads?
This would be what the string API is built on top of, and there's no real reason to hide them, especially if you have scenarios where you do want to be allocation free.
No. Why do we need the read-only and the mutable span version? Why not just the
It's
read-only?
some extension method weirdness.
Well, I mean, how often do you have a writable span that you would want to enumerate the new lines that you're not willing to write the .as read only, or to just call it in the static method or static syntax?
It might be about discoverability rather than not wanting to.
Because we certainly need
have a span of.
I see that we totally need the read only one. It's the writable one.
Yeah.
Is that's the like? Do we need it?
It's if you have a span of char that's backed by like a stack alloc buffer or a rented array or something like that, the extension methods won't show up. We did it for every other extension method on read or on memory extensions. We have both read-only span and span overloads.
Fair enough.
Like, I think that's just the pattern we use.
And the line here is always environment.newline.
No, it's the same any of the 7 characters.
Yeah. It searches for the 7 characters called out in the encode stack. And then just splits on them.
Maybe I'm confused. What's the line ending string in the normalized line endings? What's the parameter?
It's what you want to replace it with.
Now it's called replacement text.
Yeah. If you want
that helps.
If you call the parameterless overload, it replaces anything that it found with environment on newline based on your current operating system. You can tell it to replace it with a different character or a different string instead.
Got it. The new name helps me. So
Yeah.
good job on the new name.
That is a sentence that we never hear uttered here ever. So thank you.
Okay.
This ended up being surprisingly non-contentious, a little bike shitty maybe.
Yeah, like, I guess my only concern right now is we have span rune enumerator and span line enumerator, and the difference between them is one has an RU and the other says LI.
Sorry, what was that?
Span rune enumerator and span line enumerator are identical, except this RU becomes that LI.
Oh, okay. Yes.
So
and
like
they have very different behaviors inside.
Okay, I guess the get enumerator or the move next is where all the complication is coming in.
Move next is very, very different between the two.
All right,
and
that makes
because
sense.
it's a rough struct, like we can't dynamically change it. Like we can't just return a subclass rough struct to you where you call a virtual implementation.
Yeah, it makes. I guess it makes sense that they're not. In my head, they were both weak wrappers over something else that was doing the work. But if they're actually the thing doing the work, then that certainly explains why they're different.
Plus, nobody sees the names, right? Normally, they just
ideally you just use it for each.
No, this is. If we come up with a good name now, can we avoid adding another copy of this the next time we have something like this? But if they're actually the ones doing work, then it makes sense. Is span rune enumerator non-constructible? I mean, like, it's default.
I mean,
but
it's a rough struct. You could default it if you call move next. I think it just says empty.
The question is, can somebody call the rune one with new span rune enumerator, and then give it the span to start running off of?
This is the only way to construct it.
Okay.
Using this extension method.
Okay, so it has a internal or something constructor, but it's also a struct, so it has a default constructor.
Yeah, if you default it, it's basically the equivalent of having done memory extensions dot enumerate whatever read only span of char dot empty. It's basically the equivalent. Like move next will return false.
Yeah, and that it was just are we missing a constructor for the parity? And if no, that's fine.
Yeah.
All right. I should let people see what my notes are.
Yeah.
All right. Did I get everything right?
That looks correct.
Yeah, it looks right to me.
And then I can also follow up with Tarek offline and see if maybe we can come up with some good examples where a char overload would make sense.
Mm-hmm.
Works for me. Thank you all. I will stop monopolizing this week's reviews.
Are you sure about that? That doesn't seem you.
Maybe.
See if anybody can talk about this one. Thread pool bound handle allocate unsafe native overlapped. 42549er. Does anyone know what most of these words mean?
Yes.
I know
just
what
think
most
Fowler
of
as
the
well.
I know what most of the words are. Just not what Fowler wants here.
I know what most of the words are, and I know how the order in which those words are uttered affects how the runtime works.
Wow.
But I already promised I would stop monopolizing reviews. But okay, I guess I can talk to this then. So we have APIs when you're interoping with Windows asynchronous Win32 methods. Those methods tend to take a structure called an LP overlapped. We have a native overlapped structure in .NET, which is basically a projection of the Windows overlap structure in managed code. The typical way that you would do this is you would use an allocate native overlapped method in order to generate a pointer to one of these things. However, as with most asynchronous helper APIs, they do things like capture the execution context, which means that when the callback eventually gets dispatched, it will have all of your async locals, it will have your current identity, and so on. Traditionally, the pattern that we've used to say, I don't want to capture the execution context, I just want to invoke on the thread pool thread, just have fun, or I just want to invoke on the IO completion port thread, have fun. Traditionally, we use the unsafe prefix or suffix on our async APIs to say, by the way, whenever you set up the infrastructure, please do not capture the execution context. This is basically adding that same pattern to thread pool bound handle.
Fair enough. So if this is using unsafe in the thread pool way, which makes sense since those words both appear, isn't that usually used as a prefix and not a? So it's always before the verb. It's unsafe I believe, Q instead of Q unsafe.
I believe it should be a prefix. I hope the scenario made sense.
Yes. Now that this is I see that there is an allocate native overlapped with the same signature, and this is put the word unsafe to mean don't capture execution context. And now I think the only thing is where does the word unsafe go? And I think it's generally the leftmost word.
Yeah, normally it goes in front. I had also mentioned as part of this issue, we should also consider making a similar change on the pre-allocated overlap class. This is thread pool bound handle specifically that Fowler talks about at the front here. That pre-allocated overlap is a very similar type, and I think it would be best to make the change at the same
time. What type was that? There was a mechanical keyboard that blocked my ability to hear.
Pre-allocated overlap. If you go to apis.net, you can see it. Right now, it has a constructor, which takes an IO completion callback and all that good stuff. We can't really overload a constructor to say unsafe. So what I had proposed, pre-allocated overlap is the name of the type. So what I had proposed we do in addition here is have an unsafe create static factory method hanging off of this, that basically calls a constructor but also suppresses the execution context.
All right, Stefan, you've been muted because your keyboard was driving me crazy. Okay, so instead of mixing a constructor and create, wouldn't it make sense to just add a Boolean parameter of capture execution context or skip capture execution context?
We have considered stuff like that in the past. The problem is, like, we really want people to write the word unsafe.
Fair enough.
But it's, I think we actually had this exact same question. Where did we have this before? I swear this came up like 2 years ago.
I just saw never mind from.
Is it creating the object unsafe, or is it when you actually call the allocate?
It creates an object that has unsafe behavior once in a while. So
and
basically,
that's because it doesn't capture the execution context.
Correct. So you could imagine that the object is tainted or poisoned, or choose your adjective. But we don't want to stop you from creating such an object because you might actually have valid use cases for it. The problem is, like, we really want you to think long and hard before you create an object using this mechanism.
So for instance, and this is what I was noisily typing in the chat, sorry for not being muted, but I'll say it for the video. I tried using the existing version of this API in Kestrel when we were first moving over to managed sockets. It's a lot faster than managed sockets just doing that. You can get faster yet by running your own thread that manages its own IOCP loop. And part of that reason is because we no longer had to capture the execution context.
Yeah.
So I do think there's value for sure.
Yeah, it can kind of.
David proposed it.
Yeah, this can kind of be mimicked today by using I think execution context, not suppress flow before you call this API.
I don't know if that existed then, but you're probably right.
Okay.
Maybe.
But it's to be honest, suppress flow is a little unwieldy, and there are times where it's really not good to call. And it also means that as you unwind, you have to make sure you're unwinding properly, which means you have to consider exception filters and blah 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 while you're unwinding it. It's just a pain in the ass. So having an API that does it for you is convenient. And as I commented here, like, I think it would be good to do pre-allocated overlap at the same time, but it wasn't part of the initial proposal, so if it's not done, I'm not going to ship.
I mean, I don't have strong feelings. It's a type I've never even heard of, so it seems a little already off in the weeds, and I can get behind the we don't do the Boolean anywhere else, so we'll make unsafe create and then copy the constructor signature.
Yeah, to be fair, like, no one's asking for it. Like, I just thought, like, it would be good to do at the same time, but yeah.
I mean, I guess if
And
no
then
one's
we
asking
have
for
to
it and it's easy enough to do with calling whatever suppress flow is, then we can. I mean, either we can wait.
2.0 apparently. I was just pointing out I was wrong. It's been there since like .NET 2.0, but either way, I didn't know about it at the time.
But yeah, I mean, if we think it's basically the same thing but from a different angle, then because I think Steve said it's better perf and people generally want to use it.
Yeah.
Lower overhead, etc. So you might want that one. So I don't know. I guess I'm feeling generous.
Do it.
By the way, pre-allocated, the A is capitalized. You're welcome.
It's not my fault. My predecessors don't know how to spell. It's not that. I mean, I guess somehow I did become the, like, how do we spell this word guy? I guess because I'm the last one to touch the book, and we have opinions on how we spell things. Hooray.
I am looking through the pre-allocated overlap constructor right now, and I did confirm that it does in fact capture the execution context, which is unfortunate. But so this could help people who probably should be nudged toward it.
All right, and there's no bang. That's just emo being emo. All right. I think I got that.
That looks right to me.
Since I copied it from APIs of .NET.
Yep.
All right.
And we'll figure out whatever the proper nullable annotations are. They'll just mimic whatever is already there.
All right. We happy? Good enough.
Sure. I think, Eric, you're up finally. I know you've been wanting this for a while.
We're here. We fucking
are.
up.
All right. Instantiated generic method infos from generic type definition method infos 45771.
Okay, so with the trimming effort, we've kind of ran into a pattern of code, and we're trying to introduce a new API to make this pattern a little bit more trim friendly, I guess. And so the example of the pattern is you take in some object that you want to get. The object's type is a generic type, and you want to call either a method or a property on it, and you know the type is generic, but you don't know what the generic instantiation is. And so you can't statically say, like in the example I have listed here, I want to get the result of task of T, but I don't know what the T is, right? And so I have this object, I know it's task of T, but since I don't know what the T is, I have to take the actual instantiated type and call get method on it, get result. And so this isn't trim friendly because the linker can't tell that here's a place where somebody is trying to get the result property from task of T. And so it could trim it. Granted, you're never going to trim result of task of T, but imagine any other generic type. And so the proposal here is to be able to use task of open close braces dot get method get result, store that statically, and then take that method and say, okay, now that I have the instantiated task of int or whatever string, from that thing, give me the method that is the same one, has the same metadata definition as this method info that I got off of task of open generic T. So like if you scroll down to the usage example, so the first line, I'm getting task of open generic T, I'm getting its get result method, and I'm storing that statically. And then when I'm running my code that's taking in the task, I can call this new method on the task type that I called from task.getType, and I get back the instantiated task of T method info.
So to clarify, get method on an open generic already works, but you can't then get the like closed generic version of it from that currently without this method.
Right, you can't invoke. So the problem is we want to invoke this method definition, or this method info, and you can't invoke the open generic method info on the closed generic type.
Right. And if you do it the way everyone does it today, which is like the first example, it's not trim friendly. Is like the point.
Yeah.
Correct, because if you scroll up, because the way people do it today is they call object.getType to get the actual closed generic type, the actual instantiation of what this thing is. So this would actually be task of int or task of string. And then from that type, they call get method some string. And so like you can't statically verify which type get result is actually going to come from, right? Because you called object.getType and it could be any type. So that's why it's not trim friendly. But the usage example is statically, you can statically verify that on task of open generic, I need the get result method.
I love that. Like, I feel like this should have already existed. The name is really long though.
Yeah, the name's up for debate for sure.
Yeah.
Like there's already a method called has same metadata definition on member info. Is that right? And so at first I tried to model it after that.
Yeah, I think in an ideal world, like I'm wondering if we can just make, if you have an open generic method and you pass it a closed generic instance parameter, like I wonder if we could just make that work. But I mean, you pass it to the invoke method, that is. But there might be good reasons that we can't do that for whatever reason. And this is a really good alternative, I think.
You mean by getting the type off of the thing you passed in?
No, I mean, like, so say that you have a method info that corresponds to task of open dot get result. Like, just to make life easier, like, we should consider allowing you to invoke that on a closed task.
That would help as well, actually.
Yeah. But I think I would like to investigate doing that in addition to approving this API. I'm sure there are reasons that that's completely non-trivial.
Right. You just want that to work.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
for this API, should the method just take the type and the name of the method instead of taking the method info? Because like this API will require people to call first, to get the method info and just passing it to this method to get the closed method info.
but I think that was actually intentional.
Yeah, this is for linker friendliness, correct?
Because here the linker can see exactly what type is involved and it now routes this method.
Whereas in the running code, in the complete method, it has no idea what task underscore type is, because task.getType could return task of T, or there could be some other task, other class that inherits from task that isn't task of T. It could be that as well.
Yeah, but you have to get this, the method info from the task of T type, right?
Correct.
First line. So if you have this type already, like type of task of T, which will be the closed type. Like why we don't just pass this type to the proposed method?
Sorry, what type are you passing to the proposed method?
Do you see first line? Type of T of task of
open. Yeah. So this is task of open.
Okay, so where the closed type will be involved here? Oh, this task type?
Yeah.
Right. The closed type comes like at runtime. Somebody's calling this complete method and passing in some instance of the task. And so there's no way to know, is it going to be task of int or task of string?
Yeah,
well,
like
the linker doesn't even know if it's tasked. Well, I guess the linker could know that this is tasked because it comes as a parameter. But like generally the linker, when you call get type, doesn't know what the actual type is, I would imagine.
Right, unless it's a variable of a sealed class, right? Then it could tell you if task was sealed, then it could tell statically this thing's sealed, you're calling get type, I guarantee it's going to be one of these types.
It is guaranteed type of the word that you said right here. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So with the current proposed name, my initial reading is, but the generic member would be a member that was generic, not a member on a generic. Like, I understand that is a different scenario, and maybe it would even work, but you actually don't want to match generic members. You want to match members off of a generic type instantiation, which is even longer. I wonder if it's just like find matching member and you give it a member info, and then the answer is like it does the finds a member who dot has same metadata definition is true, and you're like, how would I know to call that? It's like, well, you're doing this one weird thing. And then, yeah, because if you pass in a thing that doesn't come from the same generic type definition, is that throw or just return null? I'm guessing it's just return null. Null is just I couldn't find it for whatever reason, but
I would assume it just returns null. I don't know if we'd need to throw in that case, but
because is this
or
really?
If you were calling it on a non-generic type.
Yeah, is this really just basically for each member info in this dot get members, return the first one that has same metadata definition as returns true for?
That would be the naive implementation of this method, yes.
Sure. So if you grabbed a member info off of a non-generic type, it's just going to return the input argument if it actually belonged to that type. So
yeah, we could make it work that way. We could either try to verify and throw up front if it's non-generic, or
yeah, well, that's what I'm saying. Like, if the implementation is basically, if it's going to be equivalent to that for loop, then it seems like just something like find matching member is.
And not tie it to generics at all necessarily.
Because if it works for actual generic methods, so a specified generic method, which I guess doesn't make sense. You wouldn't have that on a type info because you'd have to get the info and then call make generic. Yeah. Anyway, like I'm just the name feels a little weird and unwieldy, and I was trying to come up with a better name for it.
So get member with same metadata definition as,
which was apparently his original proposal.
Yep. Because we have get member and we have has same metadata definition as, and combine the two.
Yeah, I mean it's straightforward. Tells you what it's going to do.
Right. The semantics are the exact same as this other method over here, except for I'm going to find the one, as opposed to you asking, are these two the same?
Right. So yeah, I mean it's an unwieldy name, but reflection names aren't always nice. I mean, we have things like get property impl. So.
Or you had started saying something there?
I was going to say, can you scroll down to where we proposed that, but I can do it myself on my own screen.
Yeah, I don't see where anybody has the as, like they seem to have left the as off.
Yeah, Steve Harder was the one who proposed the get member from generic member definition.
But this can be called with the non-generic types, right?
I think that's up to us to decide whether whether we want to throw or if we want to return.
It can return a valid info, right? Can return.
I mean, if
valid,
we call it
the same
generic,
method info.
if we put generic something inside of it, feels like it kind of shouldn't work if you're not generic. So that's why not putting generic in the name probably helps.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, I kind of like. I mean, the name's really long, but I kind of like Levi's go with the original name, but put the as on the end because it matches the one on member info.
That's why I like that one. That's why I proposed it originally as well.
Yeah.
Again, like we don't expect, thousands of developers to ever call this. It's just in the case where you do need it, right? Like you care about trimming some reflection code that's reflecting over a generic type. This would be the pattern we would want you to use. I think in the BCL, I maybe saw this 4 to 5 times, maybe, in different libraries. So it's not uncommon.
What? Oh.
And the semantics are if has a method definition as returns true for 2 members, this thing will return that member. Right? Like the semantics are the same.
Yeah, like to be all linkified, it's get members dot first or default m dot has thingy member.
Okay.
I mean, that's what it sounds like. It's the current, even with the get from generic definition was going to do. So it just seems it doesn't help you understand what scenario you want to call it from, but the one on member info doesn't help you with that either. So it's exactly the same level of like, yeah, I'm a thing. So, all right. Anybody want to object?
Yeah, one last question just for clarifying for me. I mean, so if I have the type is a generic type, is not closed generic type, and calling this function on it, this method on it, what will happen? So I have like, I'm getting like type of T, I mean, is not closed type, and I'm calling this method and passing some member info to it. What will happen at that time?
You'll get the version off of whatever class you called from. So it'll do whatever the runtime does. Which I assume is it'll have something, because the open generic had something.
But you will not be able to call invoke on it after that.
Sure. You weren't able to call invoke on it when you called it off of getMember in the first place. There's a thing hanging off of member info that answers whether or not it's still an unresolved generic. I just don't remember what it is. But I think it exists somewhere. You might have to go to its type, but because you can say things like I'm like 90% sure that's legal.
Yeah, there is some weird way in the runtime to get like a partially closed generic.
And so now you would
I
get
don't remember it.
the version of the member instead of off of dictionary of comma, you would get it off of dictionary int comma, and it'll still be not invocable, but you'll get a thing. It's reflection. It exists. You could find it. It'd be the same as calling type of dictionary of int comma dot get member, and you pass it enough things to correctly identify the member. So I don't think it needs to resolve the ambiguity and the lack of invocability, because this is very clear at what it does. It returns the thing where if you take return from this and it's not null, dot has same metadata definition as this, it will return true. That's why I like the name, even though it's really long.
Okay.
And we decided return null instead of throw.
I feel like that's what everything else on reflection does.
Many of them, yeah. So a lot of the reflection APIs for things like get method will say, well, I can't find a method with that name, so I'm going to return null. I don't know if this is a special case because it's saying give me it's saying basically I expect this member to be on this type, like please give me the matching member definition. I don't know. It's probably a edge enough case where returning null is just fine.
I think the only case where we throw is arg null exception.
Yeah.
Well, get member throws if there's more than one member with that name.
Yeah.
But
no, I meant for this API. Sorry.
Oh yeah.
I think that's the only place we would need to throw, is you passed in null. For everything else, if there something goes wrong, just return null.
Is there ever a case in linkerland where an instantiated generic could lose a method that the open generic had to keep? Like, would it understand that task of int, well, okay, task's a bad one because there aren't enough members on it, but that, dictionary of int to int never called try get value, but dictionary of int to long did, so only leave that one copy?
No. For the linker, no. For ALT, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, because the linker's working just with MSIL, right?
Yeah. But for ALT, you lose code if you don't have the actual instantiation for it.
Okay. Yeah. So I think that this solves the problem. The name's unwieldy, but it's reflection.
Shit, that will make Eric very happy.
Can we just add I task?
It's not just task. There's other members.
There's more?
Well, there's more places that we
generic, I guess, right? It's like
like
isaac enumerable, channel a T.
Even
anything you want to grab the T from.
Even nullable, right?
Yeah.
This object's nullable. How do you get stuff off of it? Even
honestly,
even to call the has value, right? Even to call nullable has value, you need this. You need to do this kind of stuff.
We need a thing for this, like some kind of like you do a runtime type test to find the type, and then you can like do a in place, cast or something.
We need a mod. No, I'm just kidding.
If we didn't have a specialized instantiation for value type generics, then this would probably be less of an issue.
Yeah. Did we approve my API? I just came to check.
We moved unsafe from the second word to the first word, but yes.
Nice. All right.
And we added it to pre-allocated handle.
Yeah, we added unsafe.
We actually gave you 2 APIs, not 1. You should be happy, David.
Nice. Pre-allocated had the same thing? Cool.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
Yeah, you couldn't new it up without it capturing, unless you did suppress flow. Is what we
I know, right? It's gross. It's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, now it'll be pretty for you.
Cool. All right. Add public key methods for x509 certificates.public key 48510. This is me. So on x509 certificate 2, we have methods. Some of them are extension methods, like get RSA public key. We also have this property hanging off certificate called public key, which returns an instance of type public key, which is a way to describe the public key. But once you get that object, you can't actually get back to key material without writing a decoder yourself. It turns out we basically have these methods as internal for places that we can accept a public key and then work with it. And the suggestion is just make them public. So they have the same semantics as certificate.getRSA public key or certificate.public key.getRSA public key will give a semantically equivalent value.
Sounds good to me.
I'm looking at the internal implementation real fast, and it looks like the constructor takes an asymmetric algorithm. So would you not just expose the asymmetric algorithm and have the caller cast?
No, because we can also create it from bytes. Like you can make a public key of asymmetric algorithm, but you can also just give it this is the encoded representation.
Oh, I see that. Yeah, it takes the OID and everything else.
Yeah,
okay.
and then we would have the whole great, who's allowed to call dispose. Plus, we're back to casting, and we hate casting in the asymmetric APIs. Because then they go to RSA crypto service provider, which is terrible.
Okay. I like how when you run review and when you bring an API, it's always just sure, approve it. It's perfect. It's good to be looking.
So if we think we have time, I've got one that's just a couple down the list that should hopefully likewise be this is intrinsics, Tanner knows what he's doing, approved. It would unblock some perf scenarios.
One question. Can you go back to that other API, public key? I think we actually do this today in Castro, don't we, Stefan? On the code, no, I think we hard code the OIDs for all these things. Do the parsing and do RSA create an import key from. It's nuts. Okay, it's good. Good API.
I almost said that.
We
but
do.
Javier
We
wrote
literally.
that code.
Yeah.
So I didn't want to be too sure about it, but it seems like we could use it.
Yeah. Okay, this is perfect. Thank you.
Cool.
Approved.
I don't know why you guys are doing it, but I'm sure it makes
We
sense.
shouldn't be, but I'll show you the.
Tanner, is yours 52017?
So there's that one and 49397. They're basically a pair, but they're both basically, let's take what we already have on vector T, now expose it on the intrinsic vector types. That way we can also write generic code for those where it exists.
So which one do you want to talk about in the next 5 minutes?
This one would unblock more perf than the other one.
Okay.
But so basically it's take everything we expose on vector of T today, mirror it onto vector 64, 128, and 256 of T. That way, when you are targeting both ARM and x86, you can write one code path where the algorithm is the same and only drop down to actual hardware-specific intrinsics where you have those platform-specific differences. So within corelib, this would allow us to take most of our generic code paths and trim them down, except for where we use move mask.
We really called not one's complement.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, we are wonderful people. I guess APIs like square root would fail if given a non-floating point T. How does it work with vector of T today?
Vector of T today does it using float and then rounds down to the nearest integral. So we have the exact same behavior we expose on vector of T, just with well-defined vector sizes.
Got it. Because my only concern would be what policy we're putting on these types that aren't necessarily intrinsic policy. If that policy is minimal, then I don't really have concerns.
Right. It's very, very minimal.
Where's vector of t live? Numerics?
Yeah, numerics. And then the related non-generic vector class of the same namespace.
I was going to say, you seem to be defining a whole lot of things that weren't there, but this is the
Yep.
vector dot and then the generic method that takes the... Okay.
Correct.
Which is, yeah, the non-generic thing has a lot of... These all need the t's in their definitions, don't they?
Yeah, they would, but
so they're all
I left
some
that
bad
up
copy
to-
pasta.
Yeah.
Because like these have it, but these don't get it because these are just specific overloads.
Right. There's a few of them that are specific because you always go from sbyte to short, for example.
Yeah, but like equals all and equals any should have been declared
Yeah,
generic.
they should be the generic there.
Yeah.
But specifically, the commented out ones are ones that we expose as static methods on the fixed size types because it's more performant, and we should never have done them as instance methods on vector of t in the first place. So it's still an instance method. It's just an extension instance method so that it can be performant, because otherwise it's address taken, and that hurts optimizations in the JIT, which follows the pattern that we've done for the rest of the methods on vector 64 and 128.256.
Okay, so the comment is these instead of being instance are these extensions.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, this makes sense to me in large part. There are some things that stand out to me as strange, like why is square root renamed? Why does widen return a tuple rather than having out parameters? And so on.
Yeah, those are following the recommendations and best practices that we've, changed since we shipped vector of t in 2014. So it's all of the improvements that the JIT has made, that the JIT has taken in, and that we've done with corresponding intrinsic APIs that we've exposed. So we prefer tuples for these cases. We prefer the consistent naming with math, etc.
And tuples returning lower before upper makes sense to you?
Yep, that matches how we do it for the multiply APIs, like Big Mole and such, and corresponding. Plus all the ARM intrinsics that return tuples.
Flout.
Yes.
Okay. You're right. It's numerics. Shrug.
Yep.
Does anybody have anything other than shrug?
Vector 64 is hardware accelerated. Will that return false on x86?
Yes, it will be. Vector 64 will be false on x86, and vector 256 will be false on ARM. Vector 128 will be true on both. Vector 256 in particular, you can emulate as hardware accelerated, but that's out of scope. And that would end up being mostly an implementation detail because it's not hardware accelerated in the scenario in the way you might think it is. So it would strictly return false.
So that's kind of interesting because normally on the ISAs, is hardware accelerated means this ISA is supported, whereas here you're saying, like, does the hardware even understand this as a native data type?
Correct.
But
it's
here
you can't accelerate a vector 64 on x86, for example.
I wonder if that would be. I wonder if having all of these as supported APIs would be confusing. Though, given the target audience, maybe that would just be a doc issue.
Yeah, I think it just mirrors exactly what we do for vector of t, and so I think it will be understandable to people in the same
Okay. And you
The-
don't
the-
imagine this? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Sorry, I just keep coming back to Vector 64. Like, and we don't imagine a scenario where we would just implement it in terms of Vector 128 and then say, like, look, it is hardware accelerated. It's just we only care about the low keyword.
No, I don't think we would. We could hardware accelerate it like that, but I think just like with Vector 256, if you were to even if you were to implement it in terms of two 128-bit ops, you would not say it's accelerated because it's not accelerated in the fashion that we typically say vector of t is accelerated.
Okay, I'll buy that argument.
Yeah.
So
those ones should never, the ones that return long and int should never have been defined in the first place. They hurt algorithmic throughput and no one actually uses them.
Okay.
If you're taking in double and float, you should be returning double and float.
I thought it was a little weird, but it was just like, this doesn't match the other pattern of something is commented out for reasons.
Yeah. Yeah, and then the one that Levi brought up, the other issue 52017, it's basically this issue. It's an extension to this issue, which is support native int and unsigned native int. It exposes like 12 new methods.
We already do that on Vector T nowadays, right?
Yep.
Okay.
And we'd like to expose that for the general types as well. Now that one I don't mind so much if we wait until next review period to go over, just because there are two linked issues with it, which is extending x86 and the ARM sub namespaces to also support native int.
If we only approve this one at the moment, can you make forward progress, or do you really need both to come at the same time?
Nope, I can make forward progress with just this.
Okay.
Then the native int support, I want in for .NET 6 if we can, but it's not top-down work, so it's not blocking.
Yeah, it would. Since we did the work for Vector T already, like I would personally like to see it expanded here. So I will help push for that.
Yeah, but I'm already spending so long on cleaning up copy and paste here that I don't want to do another.
There is no copy paste on the other one. There's nothing to clean up there.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's intended. I'm sorry. I think it's pretty clear, like, what methods should have the T generic and what shouldn't. So I would just trust that they would be done correctly.
Yeah, hence modular
Copy
typos.
paste aside.
Extension.
Yeah.
See, Jeremy hates extensions so much he can't bring himself to type it.
Well, apparently it's that once I start talking, I can't remember what I was typing, which is, I guess that's always been true. I'm good at typing and listening, but not typing and talking.
Oh, well, we're down to only 4 people in this chat right now.
Yeah.
This is very much like an Illuminati smoke-filled room.
We're still streaming though, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. In particular, this will unblock that change where we've got a couple community people from the community that are really interested in changing GUID to like use vector 128 compare. It will just be able to use operator equals now. And then likewise, it will allow us to normalize a bunch of our own logic to be much simpler. Rather than having like 2 to 4 completely disparate code paths, we can just have one with a couple branches in the middle.
Yeah, in particular, I know that throughout the text processing logic, we have SSE2 and ARM64 code paths.
Yeah.
And the only thing that they need to do differently is how they read the data. But like, I don't want 2 code paths for I'm anding these things together.
Exactly.
And they'll be as efficient as calling the underlying intrinsics APIs, right?
Correct. Possibly even more so, because with the helper APIs, we have some leeway on we're not hard coded to one instruction. We have some leeway of picking the best instruction.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, I would be I would be willing to start rewriting some of our internal stuff in terms of these APIs once they go in to, make our own logic easier and kick the tires a bit.
Yep.
All right. So there's a question in chat about some creative T that takes a T array that has an overload for the number of elements to take. Does it make sense to have an overload with an offset? And I think that the answer is, if that's not something we already had in Vector, then it's a new API proposal, so it's not related to this issue.
Yeah, and there should be create T array int index.
Yeah,
there's one that takes there is one that takes a read-only span, a T array, and a T array int index.
Yeah, those are all here in this proposal.
Yeah, okay. So there's not one that's the number of elements, it's the how far in to start.
Right, because the number of elements is fixed.
Yep. So, all right, there you go, chat. It's already there. Ah, I missed a block of commented things. Oh no, I'm back up at your thing at the top.
And I understand what to do here, even if it's commented.
Yep. Well, really, it's just so that the email, assuming I remember to hit the button, that the email is a little cleaner. So, all right. As my very oddly sized Teams window currently shows, where we've lost quorum and we're over time, so we will see everyone who cares to join us again at Tuesday, 10 a.m. I assume. I didn't actually look at my calendar. Have a good weekend.
And if nothing's blocking, we can get in and improve then.
Hey, I have things above you. I was nice and skipped my thing.
Yeah, that one looked like a big issue though.
I mean, it's one issue that has, like, we need to copy this on the 20 overloads. So
looks good to me. Let's ship it.
Yeah, I see. There's only one review scheduled for next week. We might need to place another one. There is also a 4-day weekend coming up next week, and so
yeah, I think it'd be good to have a second one just from the perspective of let's get down the non-blocking backlog if we can.
We just need to make sure that it's not. We just need to make sure it's not Friday or the following Monday.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Sounds good.
All right. In chat, is there a public schedule for these streams? No. Tuesday at 10 a.m. Redmond time is the only one that's expected in a given week, but we've been trying to play catch up, so we've been throwing some in ad hoc, which is why I've been announcing at the end of each meeting when the next one is. But well, I'll leave that for Emo if he wants to find a way to make that public. Especially because he's not here, so he can't say no. All right. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Yep, you both have a good week. And